Imagine your entire worldview, everything you believe about the cosmos, about family, your place in society, is suddenly and completely challenged. Well, that's pretty much what happened in colonial Bengal, when ancient, deeply held beliefs crashed headfirst into the radical new ideas of the modern West. It's a story of crisis for sure, and a lot of confusion, but it's also a story of incredible creativity that ended up sparking a full-blown renaissance.
So let's just drop right into a scene from 1882. You've got this Tibetan noblewoman decked out in silks and jewels, and she poses this absolutely startling question to a Bengali explorer. See, she just found out that in some places, a man has only one wife. And she was baffled. Her own culture practiced polyandry, where she, the wife, was the head of the house with several husbands. I mean, that one little moment, that single exchange, it perfectly captures the kind of cultural shock we're about to unpack.
Because really, that's the big question here, isn't it? What happens when everything you take for granted, how a family should be, how the world was made, what your place in it all is suddenly just thrown into doubt? And this isn't just some intellectual game. It's a deep, profound shock to the system. And it's exactly what went down in 19th century Bengal.
Right, so that conversation we just heard, it's way more than just a quirky little anecdote from a history book. It's really a powerful symbol of two completely different worlds colliding, and it shows us just how deep-seated the assumptions were that were about to get shattered.
The man who wrote this down was named Sarat Chandra Das. He was on a trip to the then-forbidden capital of Lhasa. So when he explained that in India, a man could have several wives, the Tibetan lady shot back that in her society, a woman was the real lady of all the joint earnings and inheritance of all the brothers. To her, her situation was obviously way better. And that conversation just powerfully shows that the most basic ideas, things like marriage, they weren't universal truths at all. They were just local customs. And that realization, that was just the beginning.
Okay, so to really grasp the scale of the shockwaves this sent, we first have to understand the world that existed before all of this. Let's try to map out the traditional cosmos as people in Bengal actually saw it.
For a lot of Hindus in Bengal, the universe wasn't, a bunch of planets zipping around a sun. No, it was this magnificent layered creation. It all started with a great void. Then, a king turtle rose out of the waters. On its back, a heavenly elephant. And on the elephant, a great serpent, whose hood held up the earth. And the earth itself was surrounded by 7 seas, not of salt water, but of salt, sugar, wine, butter oil, curd, and milk. I mean, what a fantastically rich and poetic way to see reality.
And for the Muslim community, the origin of the world was just as profound, just as mystical. A really popular belief passed down in old manuscripts was that the whole universe came from the Nur Nabi, the divine light of the Prophet Muhammad. This light was seen as part of God's own light, and it existed even before creation itself. So you've got these two incredibly imaginative, spiritual worldviews just coexisting, forming the very bedrock of society.
And then, a totally new way of thinking arrives, carried in on the tides of colonialism. And this way of thinking, it didn't use myths or divine light to explain the world. It used logic. This was the shock of reason.
The key tool here was something called inductive reason. It's basically the idea that you build knowledge from what you can observe and from evidence, not just from holy books or tradition. A Bengali intellectual named Ram Mohan Roy became a huge figure in this movement. He started to argue that, maybe all religions have some falsehoods in them, and that reason, which he called a natural inspiration from God, was the only real tool to find truth and make society better.
And this wasn't just some debate for the elites either. Get this, when a shipment of 1,000 copies of Tom Paine's Age of Reason, which is this famously skeptical book that really goes after religious authority, when it arrived in Calcutta, it sold out almost instantly for 5 times the original price. There was a real, genuine hunger for these new, challenging ideas.
But, it wasn't a simple case of reason is good, faith is bad. Not at all. Thinkers like Ram Mohan Roy were really wrestling with the limits of this new tool. He believed reason was incredibly powerful for understanding the physical world, but he thought it was totally useless for questions that were just beyond human comprehension, like, say, the nature of God. So this created a really deep and complicated intellectual struggle.
And this struggle wasn't just happening in people's heads. It seeped into the very soul of the society, creating these deep, painful conflicts, both for individuals and for the whole community.
A huge part of this conflict played out in the colonial education system. British-run schools taught Western ideas by creating what psychologists now call a negative identity.
They would constantly pair superior Western traits with inferior Indian ones. So students were taught to be rational, not superstitious, to be manly, not effeminate, to be progressive, not decadent. This was a systematic way of teaching generations of Bengalis to see their own culture as backward, and to see themselves as inferior.
And you can really feel the weight of this on the people who had the least power to speak out. This devastating line comes from a poem by a Bengali woman, Manya Kumari Basu. Her life, her hopes, her sorrows, even her death, all of it, she says, would happen in silence. It's just a heartbreaking expression of that internalized grief and powerlessness that so many women felt, trapped between a tradition that held them back and a modernity that often just left them out.
This conflict even reached right into the home. Western thought really celebrated the individual, but the absolute bedrock of Indian society was the extended family, where your own needs were always secondary to the good of the group. You can imagine the tension this created, as young, Western-educated men were caught between this new desire for personal freedom and their age-old duty to their families.
So when a culture is pulled apart like this, what happens? Does the old world just vanish? Well, not exactly. In the chaos of this collision, something entirely new and, honestly, pretty unexpected began to emerge.
There's this folktale from the wild Sundarbans mangrove forests that tells the story perfectly. Dakshin Ray, the powerful Hindu tiger god, was the undisputed ruler. Then, along comes Barakhan Ghazi, a Muslim saint who challenges his authority. A fierce battle breaks out between them, with tigers on both sides. But here's the thing, neither one could win. So in the end, they called a truce and agreed to share the forest. From that day on, both Hindus and Muslims entering the forest would worship them both. It wasn't about conquest, it was about synthesis.
And that story, the story from the Sundarbans, is a perfect metaphor for what was happening all over Bengal. The result of this great collision of ideas was what we now call the Bengal Renaissance. And it wasn't about simply tossing out Indian tradition for Western reason. No, it was a messy, complicated, and ultimately incredibly creative fusion of the two, and it gave birth to one of the first truly modern mentalities in the entire non-European world.
And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The story of colonial Bengal is unique, sure, but the process it reveals is universal. It forces us to ask, whenever great cultures meet and clash, what parts of the old world are inevitably lost? What is gained from the new? And maybe the most important question of all is, what totally unimagined thing is created in the fusion of the two?